Tonight, we're diving into the harsh, the unpredictable, and the less glamorous reality of Renaissance Italy. Beneath the grand buildings and victories exists a much crueler truth. The reality is, you likely wouldn't survive even one day. So, before you settle in, consider liking this video and subscribing, but only if you truly appreciate what I create here. Also, share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always intriguing to discover who's watching from across the globe. Phone turned over, sound turned down low. Let's begin. Our tale starts not with a sneeze or a temperature or even a casualty, but with a seat of power, a dusty, decorated, and suddenly completely vacant seat of power in the city of Mantua. The year is 1629. The leader of the Duchy of Mantua and Montferrat, Vincenzo II Gonzaga, had passed away. He passed away without a rightful successor. And in the complex, unforgiving machinery of 17th century European power struggles, an empty throne was not a misfortune. It was a chance, a void. And nature, especially human nature, abhors a void. Two remote claimants surfaced from the depths of dynastic lineage. The first was Charles of Nevers, a Frenchman whose claim was distant but legitimate enough for Paris to pay attention. The second was Ferrante II Gonzaga, a much closer relative, but one whose claim was supported by the Spanish Habsburgs, who already controlled the neighbouring Duchy of Milan and had no desire to allow a French-controlled state to flourish in their territory. This regional dispute over a minor Italian duchy should have stayed just that, a minor note in a local record. But the 1620s were far from ordinary times. Europe was engulfed by the massive, sprawling, seemingly endless disaster known as the 30 Years' War, a conflict that had long abandoned its religious beginnings and had transformed into a raw continental battle for dominance between the French Bourbons and the Austrian and Spanish Habsburgs. And so, the minor issue of the Mantuan succession turned into a proxy conflict, a new battlefield for an old and violent drama. Cardinal Richelieu, the strategic mind behind the French crown, recognized his opportunity to weaken the Spanish hold on Italy. He supported Charles of Nevers. In reaction, the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II, a Habsburg relative to the Spanish king, perceived a French danger. He readied himself to act. And when a Habsburg emperor in Vienna chose to act in Italy, he dispatched his army. This is where our tale truly darkens. The army was not a shining force of professional warriors in the contemporary sense. It was a collection of German mercenaries, the notorious Landsknecht. These were not soldiers fighting for a banner, but for payment and pillage. They were the hardened, traumatized survivors of a decade of warfare in Germany, a region already devastated by hunger and sickness. They were a moving settlement, a mobile system of suffering, followed by a vast crowd of camp followers, spouses, youngsters, traders, and opportunists. They were not simply an instrument of imperial strategy. They were a carrier. For years, they had been traveling through the plague-ravaged regions of Germany, where the pestilence had become constant, a perpetual smouldering dread. They had developed a sort of grim collective immunity. They carried the sickness in their veins, on their garments, in the lice that fed upon them, and most importantly, in the black rats that scurried through their supply trains, invisible and unnoticed. The fleas on those rats harbored the bacterium Yersinia pestis. In the summer of 1629, this massive grey stream of soldiers, some 36,000 strong, started its slow descent. They were commanded by Count Rambaldo di Colalto, an Italian serving imperial interests. A man assigned a straightforward military goal: cross the Alps, capture Mantua, and remove the French-supported claimant. They were an army not of victory, but of retribution. They travelled through the Valtellina, a crucial alpine passage, and poured out into the northern plains of Lombardy, a region of stunning prosperity. At that time, Lombardy was one of the most successful, heavily populated, and economically developed regions in all of Europe. Its cities, Milan, Bergamo, Brescia, were centres of banking, silk manufacturing, and weapons production. Its farmlands were famously productive, its citizens hard-working. It was a treasure ruled from afar by the Spanish crown, but its very interconnection, the network of roads and waterways that transported its riches, was also its greatest weakness. The Italian states, despite all their cultural refinement and wealth, were a broken patchwork of competing powers. The Republic of Venice regarded the Spanish with distrust. The Duchy of Savoy maneuvered between both sides. The Papal States worried about their own territories. There was no unified leadership, no single authority to protect the gates of the peninsula. And so the German troops arrived, They were not a blessing anyone had requested. They travelled through the territories of the Venetian Republic first, demanding provisions and shelter, a practice called quartering. They were a plague of locusts in woolen uniforms and steel armour. They ransacked villages completely, their presence a violation by itself. But they carried with them something far deadlier than robbery or brutality. It was an invisible traveller, a silent accomplice in their mission. They carried the plague. They were the messengers of an ancient horror, transporting it from the devastated core of Germany to the wealthy, unsuspecting, and fatally divided regions of northern Italy. The conflict for a deceased duke's crown was about to become completely meaningless. A far more ancient and impartial ruler was about to establish his reign. The initial indicators were minor, easily overlooked, like the whisper of dead leaves before a tempest. In the autumn of 1629, as the German Landsknecht settled into their winter encampments across the Lombard plain, a peculiar illness started to emerge in the villages they inhabited. In the tiny town situated by the shores of Lake Como, in the countryside surrounding Lecco, and in the territory of the most serene Republic of Venice, which had endured the initial burden of the army's movement, local physicians started to encounter patients with alarming symptoms. It started with an abrupt, violent fever, a headache that felt like a burning iron pressed against the mind. Then arrived the confusion, the vomiting of dark bile, and a thirst that couldn't be satisfied. But the most frightening indicator, the one murmured about in quiet voices, was the emergence of the growths. Hard, agonizing lumps, first the size of an almond, then a walnut, then an egg that appeared in the groin, the armpits, or on the neck. These were the buboes, the unmistakable mark of the pestilence, yet initially nobody dared to identify it. The term itself, peste, was a curse, a term that could destroy economies and bring cities to ruin. To speak it was to invite terror, and so a vocabulary of avoidance was quickly created. It was a dangerous fever, a specific fever, or simply the contagion. The early reports sent to the health officials, the Magistrati della Sanità in cities like Milan and Venice, were careful, loaded with uncertainty. The local doctors, trained in the medical doctrines of Galen, were themselves uncertain and perplexed. They attributed the illness to various causes, none of them accurate. Perhaps it was the unusually damp autumn which had produced a foul miasma, a toxic vapour rising from the marshes. Perhaps it was the inadequate nutrition of the peasants, forced to consume spoiled grain after the soldiers had seized the rest. Or perhaps it was an unfortunate alignment of the celestial bodies, a heavenly misfortune raining down, suffering upon the earth. The idea of contagion, of a disease transmitted from individual to individual, was grasped in a vague manner. It was why quarantine had been created centuries earlier. But the process was a total enigma. The flea, the rat, the bacterium, these were agents operating in a realm far too tiny for the 17th century mind to even imagine. The failure was not one of intellect but of vision. The distinguished physician Ludovico Sitala, a man of 80 years who had experienced the smaller plague of 1566, was one of the few who identified the enemy instantly. He observed the buboes and understood with the cold assurance of experience that the Great Death had come back. He raised the warning to the health tribunal in Milan, but his was a voice shouting in the emptiness. The officials were frozen by a common dilemma: public health versus economic survival. The health magistrates in the Venetian regions and the Spanish-governed Duchy of Milan were among the most advanced in Europe. They were the organizational descendants of the Black Death of the 14th century, established specifically to handle epidemics. They possessed the legal authority to enforce a cordon sanitaire, a sanitary barrier of guards around contaminated zones, to close down markets, to prohibit movement, and to create pest houses, the feared lazaretti, for the ill and the quarantined. They had the guidelines, but to implement it was to acknowledge the plague was there. And to acknowledge the plague was to destroy commerce. Traders would stop travelling, trade pathways would be cut off, foreign cities would deny entry to their merchandise. It meant immediate certain economic devastation in the hope of preventing a future uncertain disaster. The pressure from influential guilds and traders was enormous. They contended forcefully that these rural fevers were nothing more than a seasonal condition exaggerated by the hardships of war. They criticized men like Sitala of being fearmongers, and so the officials hesitated. They enacted partial measures. They dispatched committees to examine who came back with unclear reports. They argued the exact definition of a pestilential fever. They composed letters. They conducted meetings. They consulted astrologists. While the men in powdered wigs and starched collars discussed, the plague did not. It advanced, It journeyed with the merchant walking from one settlement to the next. It concealed itself in rolls of fabric sold at a rural marketplace. It traveled with the displaced family escaping the cruelties of the quartered troops. It followed the exact geometric paths of human trade and interaction. From the foothills of the Alps, it moved south and west, settlement by settlement, town by town, a slow, unstoppable wave of death. The town of Bolano on Lake Como was an early victim. Then the contagion crossed the Adda River. It arrived at Monza, a mere 10 miles from the great city of Milan. The city's northern entrance was now effectively the front line of an invisible conflict, but the entrance stayed open. The failure to contain the outbreak in the rural areas was the first disastrous error. It was a failure of determination, not of understanding. The guards who should have been stationed on the roads were never deployed. The barriers that should have been established were never formed. The warnings of elderly doctors were rejected as the concerns of the excessively worried. The local officials caught between difficult choices chose the route of least confrontation, of hopefulness, of denial. They wagered that it would all simply fade away in the countryside. They lost the wager. By the late autumn of 1629, the plague was no longer a rural concern. It had arrived at the walls of Milan, the largest and richest city in Lombardy, the powerhouse of the region's economy, was now under siege by an enemy it refused to acknowledge. The scene was prepared for a tragedy born not of lack of knowledge, but of pride. Milan in the winter of 1629 was a city deeply confident in its own significance. It was the crown jewel of Spanish Italy, a city of over 130,000 people, a lively center of finance, manufacturing, and art. Its citizens were proud, its traders affluent, its aristocrats influential. The city was ruled by Ambrosio Spinola, a Genoese nobleman and one of the most celebrated military leaders of the era, a man who had achieved great triumphs for Spain in the Netherlands. But Spinola's attention was directed firmly on the south, on the siege of Casale, the latest action in the chess match of the Mantuan War. The rumors of a peculiar illness in the northern territories were to him a distraction, a logistical annoyance, not an existential danger. This feeling of invincibility permeated the city's administration. The Milan elite viewed the problems in the countryside with a sort of detached sympathy. It was a peasant's sickness born of filth and destitution, something that could never penetrate the city's strong walls and refined society. Their public health commission, the Tribunale della Sanità, was on record a model of competence. It had comprehensive procedures, records, and a committed staff. But an organization is only as effective as the determination of those who direct it. And the determination of Milan's administrators was to preserve business as usual. As the first suspected instances started to surface within the city itself, a soldier coming back from the north, a trader's family, a resident of the poor outer neighborhoods, the official reaction was one of selective denial. The tribunal, under tremendous pressure from the city's economic authorities, declined to employ the word plague. They released statements assuring the public that the fevers were not pestilential by nature. They accused the handful of doctors who dared to disagree of creating panic. One doctor, a man named Taddino, later documented the sheer maddening blindness of the authorities. They witnessed the proof with their own eyes, the unmistakable buboes, the horrifying pace of the disease's advancement, and yet they refused to recognize it. Their reasons were clear. A declaration of plague would have required an instant and complete shutdown. It would have required the closing of the silk factories, the shutting of the banks, the halt of all commerce. It would have required quarantine, isolation, and economic ruin. For a city whose vitality was trade, this was a fate regarded in some circles to be worse than the sickness itself. And so they decided to accept a comfortable lie. This deadly pride reached its terrible climax as the city readied itself for one of its most beloved yearly traditions, the carnival. The winter of 1630 was nearing, and with it the time of feasting, masquerades, and festivities that came before Lent. It was a period for the city to loosen its restraints, for the social hierarchy to be playfully reversed, for masses to fill the plazas in an explosion of colour and revelry. Health authorities and cautious advisors begged the officials to call off the festivities, to permit thousands of individuals to gather together, to share meals and beverages, to dance and embrace in the cramped streets while a deadly contagion was quietly circulating among them was, they contended, an act of mass suicide. Their appeals were ignored. The governor Spinola was away, occupied with his war. The city council viewed the carnival as a vital tool for sustaining public morale. To call it off would be to confess that something was horribly wrong. It would spark panic, and panic was harmful for business. It were preferable, they concluded, to display an image of strength, of normalcy, of a city unafraid. And so the choice was made. The carnival of 1630 would take place as scheduled. It was a choice that determined the destiny of Milan. Alessandro Manzoni, in his great novel, The Betrothed, would later portray this moment with burning clarity. The city, he wrote, was readying itself to celebrate. The very wagon used to carry the first plague victim to the lazaretto was being adorned with festive ribbons for the procession. The irony was almost too flawless, too harsh. As the festivities commenced, Milan transformed. The streets filled with disguised figures, with musicians, with performers and nobles mingling with the common people. The air, already thick with the winter cold, now buzzed with laughter and music. People crowded into taverns and theatres. They shared wine from communal cups. They pushed against each other in the great Piazza del Duomo to observe parades and processions. In this joyful, disorderly and fatally close environment, the plague bacillus was provided the ideal opportunity to multiply. Every handshake, every shared drink, every breath drawn in the thick crowd was a potential path of transmission. The flea, the bearer of doom, could jump from individual to individual with effortless ease. The carnival was not just a public festival. It was a citywide mass infection event, a grand macabre celebration thrown in tribute of Yersinia pestis. The officials had gambled that the sickness was not what the alarmists declared it was. They had risked the lives of their people on the hope that everything would be acceptable. As the closing days of Carnival unfolded in a frenzy of feasting and celebration, the incubation time for thousands of new infections was already progressing. The city was a powder keg, and the Carnival had ignited the spark. When the festivities finally concluded, and the seriousness of Lent started, a new, unsettling stillness began to fall upon the city. It started with a handful of families, then a handful of blocks. The death wagons, which had been making discreet nighttime visits to retrieve the occasional victim, started to roll with increasing frequency. The bell of the local parish church tolling for the deceased began to ring more frequently. First, it was a dozen deaths a day, then 20, then 50. The official denial started to sound empty, then ridiculous, then outrageous. The city's administration, which had so confidently encouraged its people to feast and dance, now observed in dread as the results of their choice flourished like a dark flower in every district of Milan. The deadly pride had broken. In its place was a growing, awakening terror. The celebration was finished. The cost had arrived. The city's answer, its final desperate response to the growing wave of illness, was a location called the lazaretto. In theory, it was a sensible idea, a logical extension of the quarantine, a designated location for the ill, separated from the healthy, where they could be cared for and either heal or not. In Milan, this location was a massive rectangular building outside the city walls, originally constructed a century earlier by Duke Ludovico Sforza to manage an earlier outbreak. By 1630, it had been repurposed, enlarged, and in the terrified imagination of the population, changed from a hospital into something far more sinister. It became the city's extension of death, an administrative headquarters for the underworld. To be transported to the lazaretto was a sentence. The procedure started with the appearance of the apparatori, the health authorities at your door, often accompanied by the feared surgeon of the sanitar. They were followed by the manati, the corpse carriers, their wagons waiting in the street like crude rolling hearses. These men, the manati, were a breed unto themselves. They were often criminals granted a release for this suicidal work, or simply men so impoverished and hardened that the substantial pay and the permission to ransack the homes of the deceased outweighed the near certainty of infection. They travelled through the city with a frightening impunity. Immune it seemed not only to the plague, but to any feeling of compassion or propriety. They were the ferrymen on this new foul river Styx. Inside the home, the inspection was quick and harsh. A fever, a telltale growth in the armpit or groin, a bout of delirium, and the verdict was delivered. Families were ripped apart with a chilling bureaucratic finality. The ill were placed onto the wagons, sometimes resisting, sometimes begging, often too feeble to do anything but groan. The healthy who stayed behind were locked inside their own houses, a red cross painted on the door as a warning. They were now captives, their fate to be decided in the coming weeks. They would either stay healthy, slowly starving on the scarce rations left by the officials, or they would develop the symptoms themselves, their sealed home becoming their grave. until the Monati came back to force open the door. For the ill, the trip to the lazaretto was a terrifying procession. The wagons rumbled through abandoned streets, gathering more human cargo at every stop. The sounds of that journey were indelible to those who witnessed it and survived. The creak of the wooden wheels, the harsh commands of the Monati, and the thin, wailing chorus of the dying, a sound that lingered in the thick summer air long after the wagon had gone. Arrival at the lazaretto of Milan was not an entrance into a location of recovery. It was an induction into a meticulously structured system of mass suffering. The building was enormous, a great rectangle of brickwork surrounding a vast open field. Along the inner walls ran a continuous covered walkway under which were 208 small rooms or chambers. This was the plan: one patient, one chamber, a model of rational containment. But by the summer of 1630, this model had totally catastrophically failed. With thousands of new patients arriving every day, the chambers were hopelessly full. They overflowed. The ill were arranged under the covered walkways, then in the central field, subjected to the scorching sun and the pouring rain. They rested on thin mattresses of straw if they were fortunate. Most rested on the bare earth. The sheer magnitude is hard to grasp. At its height, the Milan lazaretto contained over 16,000 souls. It was not a hospital. It was a city inhabited solely by the dying and the deceased, and managed by a small, overwhelmed, and heroic group of Capuchin friars. Led by their tireless leader, Father Felix Casati, these monks became the sole source of organization and kindness in a universe of chaos. They traveled through the nightmare landscape, their brown robes covered with filth, their faces marked with an exhaustion so deep it seemed to have carved itself into their very bones. They brought water, a piece of bread, a word of comfort. They heard final confessions, their voices a low whisper against the symphony of pain. They closed the eyes of the deceased. They accomplished the impossible day after day, until many of them succumbed to the sickness themselves. Their positions taken by fresh volunteers from their order, who knew perfectly well the destiny that likely awaited them. The logistical challenge was enormous. Feeding 16,000 people, most of whom were too feeble to feed themselves, was a daily struggle. Giant pots of soup were made, a thin, watery gruel that was more gesture than nourishment. Water had to be carried from wells, a back-breaking task for the few able-bodied attendants. And then there was the issue of the deceased. The deceased were everywhere. They died in their chambers, under the covered walkways, out in the open field. The Monati made their rounds, their hooks and ropes pulling bodies from the squalor, their wagons constantly travelling toward the mass graves dug outside the walls. There was no ritual, no dignity. A life was reduced to a piece of cargo to be recorded in a ledger and then eliminated. The sensory experience of the lazaretto as reconstructed from the few surviving accounts is the stuff of nightmares. The air itself was dense, heavy with the stench of illness, of unwashed bodies, of excrement, and of death. It was a smell, one chronicler wrote, that seemed to have a physical weight, adhering to your clothes and hair, a miasma of pure despair. The sound was a constant, relentless hum of human misery. The groans of the ill, the delirious cries, the weeping of those who still had tears left to shed, the harsh, angry commands of the Monati, and underlying it all, the buzzing of immense swarms of flies which feasted on the filth and the deceased. There was no genuine treatment here. The lazaretto was not a location of medicine. It was a location of sequestration. It was a machine for dying designed to keep the plague contained, to process the infected until they either recovered through sheer luck and strength of will, or far more likely, they died. And in this macabre theatre, all the normal structures of society dissolved. The wealthy lay next to the destitute, the nobleman next to the beggar. Their wealth, their titles, their fine clothes had all been taken away. Here there was only one distinction: the living, the dying, and the deceased. And the line between them was frighteningly thin, a line that could be crossed in a matter of hours. This was the great awful equalizer. It was the grim reality of a society pushed to the absolute limit of its capacity to cope. A warehouse of humanity, where the only product was death, catalogued and carted away with a terrible bureaucratic efficiency. And into this theatre of despair, into this realm of systematic dying, would occasionally step a figure that seemed to have been summoned from a fever dream, a figure more alien than human, a silhouette of grim purpose, moving through the haze of suffering. This was the plague doctor. His appearance was by design frightening. He was covered from head to toe in a uniform that had become the very symbol of the pestilence itself. He wore a long, heavy coat of waxed leather, thick gloves, and a wide-brimmed hat that identified his profession to all who saw him. But it was the mask that captivated and horrified. A grotesque bird-like visage with a long curved beak and round glass eyepieces that stared out, emotionless and inhuman. This was not merely a costume for scaring children. It was a machine, a piece of 17th century personal protective equipment designed according to the finest medical science of the day. And the science of the day was ruled utterly and completely by the miasma theory. For the learned men of the 1600s, the plague was not transmitted by tiny invisible organisms. It was transmitted by miasma, a form of corrupted air, a toxic vapor that rose from decaying organic matter, from swamps, from filth, from the breath of the ill, and from the bodies of the deceased. This polluted air, when breathed in, would disturb the delicate balance of the body's four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and trigger the sickness. Every piece of the plague doctor's suit was an attempt to combat this miasma. The long waxed coat was thought to be impenetrable, a smooth surface from which the evil vapours would simply slide off. The hat was as much a sign of office as it was a barrier. The wooden cane he carried was a crucial tool, allowing him to examine patients, to lift their bedclothes, to point out buboes, all without the dangerous act of physical touch. But the beak, the iconic beak, was the heart of the machine. It was a primitive respirator. The tip of the beak was packed with a potent aromatic mixture of herbs and spices: mint, cloves, camphor, myrrh, rose petals, and laudanum. This pungent blend, known as a pomander, was meant to do one thing: to purify the air before it was drawn into the doctor's lungs. He would be breathing not the foul miasma of the lazaretto, but the clean medicinal scent of his own personal herb garden. The glass eyepieces protected him from the evil eye of the patient, from the very gaze of the ill, which was thought by some to be a path of transmission. He was in effect a walking self-contained fumigated environment. The irony, of course, is that the suit was probably somewhat effective, but for all the wrong reasons. The thick head-to-toe covering would have offered a significant barrier against the fleas that were the true carriers of the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The doctors had stumbled upon a partially correct solution, but based on a completely incorrect theory. These doctors were a mixed group. Some were respected physicians contracted by the city's health magistrates for a generous sum. The risks were astronomical, so the pay had to be as well. They kept counts of the deceased, witnessed wills, and offered what advice they could to civic leaders. But many more were second-rate doctors or young physicians trying to establish a reputation, or outright frauds, who saw the epidemic as a golden opportunity for profit. They travelled from town to town following the pestilence, selling their questionable services to the desperate. Their arrival in a village was a sign of doom. The sight of that beaked mask peering into a doorway was often the last thing a victim saw before being carted away. It was not a symbol of healing, it was an omen of death. And what cures did this fearsome figure offer? His medical kit was a catalogue of futility, a collection of painful and ineffective treatments rooted in the ancient theory of the humours. The primary goal was always to rebalance the body's fluids, to expel the poison. The first and most common treatment was bloodletting. Using a lancet, or even more grotesquely live leeches, the doctor would drain blood from the patient, believing this would remove the excess humour that was feeding the disease. In reality, it did little more than weaken a patient who needed every ounce of their strength to fight the infection. If bloodletting failed, there were purges and emetics, powerful laxatives and concoctions to induce vomiting, designed to violently expel the corrupted humours from the other end of the body. Patients were made to drink foul brews of hellebore or antimony, suffering through violent fits of sickness that left them dehydrated and exhausted. And then there were the buboes, the painful swollen lymph nodes in the groin, neck, and armpits that gave the bubonic plague its name. The medical thinking here was at least partially logical. These swellings were clearly a focal point of the disease, a place where the body's venom had gathered. Therefore, it had to be released. The doctor's procedure was to lance the bubo with a knife to drain the pus and infected fluid within. After draining, the wound would be treated. Some prescribed a paste of figs and cooked onions mixed with butter. Others preferred more exotic remedies, a plaster made of pigeon dung or lily root or dried toad. The most prized and most expensive treatment was to apply unicorn oil or powdered unicorn horn. In reality, the ground-up tusk of a narwhal. For those who could afford it, There was the superdrug of the 17th century, theriac, a complex honey-based medicinal jam that could contain over 60 different ingredients, including cinnamon, opium, myrrh, and most famously, the flesh of vipers. Its recipe was ancient, dating back to the Romans, and it was considered a universal antidote, a cure-all for poison and pestilence. It was, of course, completely useless against Yersinia pestis, but its reputation was so great that apothecaries made fortunes selling tiny precious doses to the terrified wealthy. Beyond these physical interventions, the plague doctor's advice focused on avoiding miasma. He would prescribe sniffing pomanders of amber and herbs. He would order bonfires lit in the streets to purify the air with smoke and heat. He would command that homes be fumigated with sulfur and vinegar, a process that would at least kill the fleas. Another accidental success. He advised against bathing, as warm water was thought to open the pores and make the body more susceptible to absorbing bad air. The result was a populace that was not only sick and terrified, but also profoundly dirty. The plague doctor, with his frightening costume and his useless, painful cures, represents the tragic failure of individual medicine in the face of an overwhelming biological force. He was a man fighting a monster with theories and tools that were hopelessly, tragically inadequate. He was a symbol of science, reaching for an answer in the dark and grasping only shadows. But while doctors across Lombardy and Naples fought a losing battle against the humours, one patient at a time, another war was being waged in the northeast. A different kind of war, a war not of medicine, but of administration. A war of ledgers, laws, and saltwater waged by the most serene Republic of Venice. Venice was different. The city of canals and lagoons had been a gateway between East and West for 1,000 years. Its wealth was built on maritime trade, on ships that brought silks and spices from the Levant and returned with wool and timber from Europe. But these ships brought more than cargo. They brought disease. Venice had lived with the plague for centuries. The Black Death of the 14th century had been a foundational trauma, an event that had burned itself into the city's institutional memory. And from that memory, Venice had built a system. It was a cold, bureaucratic, and often brutal system, but it was the most advanced public health apparatus in the early modern world. The heart of this system was a permanent government body known as the Magistrato alla Sanità, the health magistracy. Unlike in other cities where health boards were assembled in a panic when an epidemic began, Venice's was a standing committee of nobles. In times of good health, they regulated the city's sanitation, monitored food supplies, and licensed physicians. But when plague threatened, their powers became nearly absolute. They were a ministry of public health with the authority of a secret police. They could shut down trade, close the city's borders, order the demolition of infected buildings, and deploy armed guards to enforce their decrees. They operated on one core principle. The health of the Republic superseded the rights of the individual. Their primary weapon was quarantine. The very word is a Venetian legacy derived from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. This was the period of isolation the health magistracy deemed necessary for a ship, its crew, its passengers, and its cargo, to prove they were free of pestilence. The Venetian approach to quarantine was not advisory. It was law enforced by the full might of its navy. When a ship arrived in the Venetian lagoon from a port suspected of infection, it was not permitted to approach the city. It was met by patrol boats and ordered to anchor at a specific isolated mooring. Health officials would board the vessel, inspect the crew, and review the ship's logs. If there was even a whisper of suspicion, a sick sailor, a death on the voyage, a departure from a questionable port, the quarantine began. The process was systematic. Passengers and crew were ferried to one of the Republic's 2 dedicated plague islands, the lazaretti. The ship itself was subjected to a rigorous disinfection. Its cargo holds were opened and fumes of sulfur and rosemary were pumped inside. Every bale of cotton, every bolt of silk, every sack of grain was unloaded onto the docks of the quarantine island and exposed to the sun and air, turned daily by workers under armed guard. Letters and documents were passed through vinegar smoke. Nothing and no one entered the city proper until it had been purged. Venice had not one but 2 lazaretti, each with a distinct and vital function, forming a sophisticated 2-stage system. The first and older was the Lazaretto Vecchio, the old Lazaretto. Founded in 1423 on a small isolated island, it's considered the first of its kind in the world. This was the destination for those who were actually sick. It was a true plague hospital, a place of no return for most. When the health magistracy identified a case within the city, Their agents would remove the victim from their home and transport them by special gondola across the lagoon to the Lazaretto Vecchio. Their family was isolated, their home sealed and fumigated. The patient once on the island was subjected to a strict regimen of care that, while based on the same flawed medical theories as elsewhere, was at least administered with a degree of order. It was a grim, efficient machine for isolating the infected from the healthy population. The second island was the Lazaretto Novo, the new Lazaretto. This was an even larger and more complex facility, and its purpose was not treatment, but prevention. This was the great quarantine station for the suspected. It was here that the crews and passengers from suspect ships would spend their 40 days. It was a sprawling complex of warehouses and dormitories, a small self-contained town built for waiting. Upon arrival, individuals were stripped of their clothing, which was boiled or fumigated. They were given a simple uniform and assigned to a room. Life was regimented and monitored. Guards patrolled the perimeter to prevent escapes. Health officials made daily rounds checking for any sign of emergent illness. If a person fell sick, they were immediately transferred across the lagoon to the Lazaretto Vecchio. If they remained healthy for the full 40 days, they were issued a clean bill of health, a precious document that allowed them finally to enter the city of Venice. The same principle applied to goods. The Lazaretto Novo was home to immense warehouses where cargo was disinfected. A special building, the Tesson Grande, was over 100 meters long, its arched porticos designed to allow air to circulate freely around the piles of merchandise. The Venetian authorities understood intuitively that the danger clung not just to people, but to things, to the very fabric of trade. This meticulous, labor-intensive, and incredibly expensive process of cleansing the goods that were the lifeblood of their economy shows just how seriously they took the threat. They were willing to sacrifice short-term profit for long-term survival. This system was not compassionate. It was ruthless. Families were separated without ceremony. Merchants fumed as their valuable cargo sat for over a month in a warehouse, profits dwindling. Sailors were confined to a small island, their freedom completely curtailed. Any attempt to break quarantine was met with severe punishment, including execution. The health magistracy's records are filled with cold, dispassionate accounts of their daily work. Item: one man from the house of the baker near San. Jeremiah taken with fever and a swelling, sent to the Lazaretto, house sealed. Item: the ship Stella Maris from Smyrna ordered to the quarantine anchorage for 40 days due to a death at sea. It was the language of logistics, not of human tragedy. But during the Great Plague of 1630-31, it worked. Or rather, it worked better than anything else. While Milan was losing nearly half its population and its social order was collapsing into the nightmare of the Lazaretto, Venice, though it suffered terribly, losing perhaps a third of its citizens, did not break. The health magistracy's iron grip held the city together. The systematic quarantine of ships slowed the plague's entry and re-entry into the city. The swift isolation of the sick on the Lazaretto Vecchio prevented the uncontrollable household-to-household spread that devastated other Italian cities. The Venetian state, with its deep institutional memory and its unsentimental pragmatism, treated the plague not as a divine punishment or a medical mystery, but as a problem of administration and control. They fought the pestilence with ink, ledgers, laws, and guards, and in the 17th century, that was the only fight you could hope to win. The magnificent church of Santa Maria della Salute, built by the survivors in thanks for the city's deliverance, stands today as a monument not just to faith, but to the cold, hard, and ultimately life-saving logic of the Venetian Republic's quarantine. In the face of an enemy that could not be seen, an enemy that travelled on a whisper of breath or the fold of a coat, the mind desperate for an anchor sought a reason. And in the 17th century, the first and last reason for everything was, of course, God. The plague was not merely a sickness of the humours, not some unfortunate miasma rising from the swamps. No, this was something grander, more terrible. This was a judgment. The Almighty, in his infinite and inscrutable wisdom, had looked down upon the proud cities of Italy, upon their commerce and their carnivals, their art and their arrogance, and he had found them wanting. The pestilence was a divine scourge, a flail of black boils and burning fevers sent to lash a sinful people back towards righteousness. And how does one answer a divine judgment? Not with medicine, not with quarantine, for that would be to deny the very hand of God. One answers with piety, with penance, with grand, desperate public displays of faith. And so they gathered. In Milan, as the death carts began to creak through the streets with ever greater frequency, the spiritual leaders of the city, led by the aging but resolute Cardinal Federico Borromeo, decided upon a monumental act of collective supplication. They would hold a procession, a magnificent, solemn procession to carry the relics of St. Charles Borromeo, the cardinal's sainted predecessor and a hero of the last great plague in the 1570s, through the tormented heart of the city. The idea was simple, the theology clear. If the city showed its devotion, if it humbled itself before God and his saints, surely the scourge would be lifted. The city's health officials, the Tribunale della Sanità, were horrified. They understood contagion, if not its precise mechanism. They knew that crowding people together was madness. They argued, they pleaded, they presented evidence of how the disease spread in close quarters. But they were men of science, of civic administration, arguing against the terrible certainty of faith. Their protestations were dismissed as a lack of piety, a secular arrogance in the face of God's will. So the procession went forward. On the 11th of June 1630, the streets of Milan, already thick with the sweet cloying smell of death, filled with the living. The great silver urn containing the remains of San Carlo was hoisted onto the shoulders of the clergy, gleaming in the hazy summer sun. It moved like a ship through a sea of humanity. Thousands, tens of thousands of Milan citizens poured from their homes, the sick, the healthy, and the unknowingly infected, to join the slow, shuffling march. They chanted litanies, their voices a low, desperate murmur rising to the shuttered windows where the dying lay listening. They wept, they prayed. They held aloft flickering candles that dripped wax onto the grimy cobblestones. They pressed together shoulder to shoulder, breath mingling with breath, sweat with sweat. For a few hours, the city was united in a single massive pious gesture. It was beautiful, it was devotional, and it was a catastrophe. In the days that followed, the plague did not recede. It exploded. The daily death toll, already horrific, doubled and then tripled. The procession, intended to be the city's salvation, had been its accelerant. It was an act of communal prayer that became a mass vector of infection, a sacred ritual that served the plague far more than it served God. Each prayerful gasp had inhaled the pestilence. Each shared touch of a holy relic had passed it on. The irony was cosmic, and it was brutal. The very God they had sought to appease now seemed to mock them with an even greater fury. The failure of this grand gesture did not, however, lead to a crisis of faith. It simply deepened the wound of fear. If God would not save them, it was because their sin was too great. Or perhaps, the logic twisted, God had sent the plague, but it was being spread, being actively and maliciously propagated by the agents of an even darker power. If piety had failed, then it was time to look for the devil. The search for a scapegoat is as old as human suffering. When the cause of a calamity is too vast or too abstract to comprehend, we crave a simpler answer. A human face to blame. The Great Plague had created a perfect vacuum of understanding. And into that vacuum rushed suspicion, paranoia, and hatred. At first, the blame was diffuse. It was foreigners naturally, soldiers from the French or German armies whose movements had coincided with the plague's arrival. It was heretics, Protestants from the north, poisoning the wells of good Catholic cities. In some corners, the old dark libel against the Jews was whispered once more, a recurring nightmare of European history. Though in this particular outbreak, it never quite coalesced into the organized pogroms of the Black Death centuries earlier, but these were familiar, almost comforting targets. The terror in Milan would soon find a new and far more intimate enemy. It found the Untori, the Anointers. The idea was not entirely new. It had surfaced in previous epidemics, but in the superheated atmosphere of Milan in 1630, it took on a life of its own, transforming from a vague rumor into an unshakable legal fact. The story was this. A conspiracy existed, a cabal of diabolical agents, perhaps in the pay of a foreign power, perhaps in service to Satan himself. These agents, the Untori, moved silently through the city, often at night, smearing a thick yellowish-white poison onto doors, church pews, public benches, and water fonts. This greasy substance, this unguento, was said to be a potent distillation of the plague itself, brewed from the pus of buboes, the spittle of the dying and other unspeakable things. A single touch was enough to condemn a soul to the agonies of the pestilence. It was a perfect horror story, custom-made for a terrified population. It explained the inexplicable randomness of the disease. Why did one house fall while its neighbor was spared? It had been anointed. Why did a strong man die while a frail woman lived? He had brushed against a poisoned wall. The conspiracy provided a narrative, an enemy with agency. The plague was no longer just a blind force of nature. It was a deliberate evil act, and an act could be punished. A conspiracy could be uprooted. Panic spread faster than the plague itself. A smudge of dust on a door, a patch of damp on a wall, a grease stain left by a passing cart, all were now seen as evidence of the anointer's work. People began to watch each other with a frightening intensity. A stranger walking down the street was a potential untor. A neighbor who seemed too healthy was suspicious. The city turned on itself. Vigilante justice became common. Men were cornered in alleyways and beaten to death on the merest suspicion. Anyone carrying a bottle or a jar was at risk. The authorities, overwhelmed by the plague and now by civil unrest, were pressured to act, to find these conspirators and make an example of them. They needed a culprit, and on the morning of June 21st, 1630, they found one. His name was Guglielmo Piazza. He was a minor public health official, a commissioner of the Sanità. His job, ironically, was to help control the spread of the plague. That morning, he was seen walking down a street near the Porta Ticinese, writing on a piece of paper and occasionally touching the walls of the buildings as he passed. An old woman watching from her window saw this, and her imagination, primed by weeks of rumor, did the rest. She raised the alarm. Piazza was not writing a report. He was marking houses for anointing. He was not resting his hand. He was smearing poison. A mob formed instantly. Piazza was seized, beaten and dragged before the magistrates. His trial was a formality. Under the relentless pressure of interrogation, and then the hideous persuasion of the rack, Piazza's will began to crumble. The magistrates didn't want the truth. They wanted a confession that fit the pre-written script of the conspiracy. They wanted names, and in the depths of his agony, Piazza gave them one. He named a man called Gian Giacomo Mora. Mora was a barber. In the 17th century, barbers were also surgeons of a sort, who let blood and performed minor procedures. Crucially, they also made tonics and ointments. Mora was known to supply Piazza with an ink he used for his work. It was a tenuous link, but in the grip of mass hysteria, it was more than enough. Mora was arrested, his house was searched, and his shop, full of the strange alembics, vials and powders of his trade, was presented as a diabolical laboratory. Now the state had its conspiracy. Mora, too, was subjected to torture, more brutal and prolonged than even Piazza had endured. His bones were broken, his joints dislocated. He confessed to everything and anything. Yes, he had created the plague-spreading ointment. He described its fantastical ingredients under the leading questions of his tormentors. He named other accomplices, some real, some imaginary, men who were then rounded up and also tortured until they too confessed. The trial became a piece of theatre, a public ritual designed to purge the city of its fear by sacrificing a few designated demons. The judges, the public, the accused themselves, all were caught in a vortex of madness from which there was no escape. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Piazza, Mora, and several others were found guilty of conspiring to poison the city of Milan. Their sentence was designed to be a spectacle of ultimate horror. They were to be taken through the city on a cart, their flesh torn with red-hot pincers at every street corner. Their right hands, the hands that had allegedly done the anointing, were to be cut off. Then they were to be strapped to the wheel, their limbs systematically broken with an iron bar and left to die in public view, a process that could take hours or even days. Finally, their bodies were to be burned and their ashes scattered to the wind. The sentence was carried out in full, a gruesome pageant of state-sanctioned murder. But the city's vengeance was not yet complete. The house of Gian Giacomo Mora, the barber's shop where the phantom poisons were supposedly brewed, was razed to the ground. Every brick was carted away, and the soil beneath was salted so that nothing could ever grow there again. In its place, the city erected a pillar, the Colonna dell'Infamia, the Column of Infamy. An inscription in Latin was carved upon it, telling the story of the evil anointers and warning future generations of their crime. A permanent monument not to their guilt, but to the city's own delusion, its own terrifying capacity for injustice in the face of fear. The column would stand for over a century and a half, a silent, stony testament to the moment Milan, tormented by a real plague, invented a fictional one and fed it with the lives of innocent men. While Milan was consuming itself in a fever of paranoia and judicial murder, the plague, indifferent to human drama, continued its silent, inexorable march. It moved with the rhythms of trade and travel, carried south along the dusty roads by merchants, pilgrims, and fleeing refugees. It crept over the Apennine Mountains, a slow, invisible tide, and began to seep into the green hills and fertile valleys of Tuscany. Its ultimate destination was the jewel of the region, the heart of the Renaissance, the city of humanism and reason, Florence. If any city in Italy was prepared for a public health crisis, it was Florence. Unlike Milan, which had been caught in a storm of political and military chaos, the Grand Duchy of Tuscany was stable, well administered, and possessed a public health bureaucracy that was the envy of Europe. The Florentine Magistrato alla Sanità, the health board, was no ad hoc committee thrown together in a panic. It was a permanent and powerful institution, vested with extraordinary authority in times of epidemic. For decades, it had studied the movement of diseases, refined the practice of quarantine, and developed a sophisticated, if not entirely effective understanding of contagion. As news of the plague's devastation in Lombardy arrived, the Sanità did not wait for the pestilence to appear at the city gates. It acted. A strict cordon sanitaire was established, a guarded perimeter meant to choke off all traffic and trade from the infected north. Health passes became mandatory for any traveller wishing to enter Tuscan territory. Inside Florence itself, a meticulous census was conducted, and the city was divided into districts, each with its own officials responsible for monitoring the population's health. They established quarantine stations known as lazarettos outside the city walls, sprawling, grim complexes designed to isolate the sick and those who had been in contact with them. The city's physicians, robed in the strange beaked masks that have become an emblem of plague, prepared their useless remedies of vinegar fumes and herbal poultices. Florence was a fortress of reason, a city girded by regulations and rational foresight, standing against the coming tide of biological chaos. But a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. A cordon is only as effective as its most corruptible guard. The complete shutdown of trade with the North was economically devastating. Merchants desperate to move their goods offered bribes. Travellers desperate to reach home found ways to slip through the patrols in the dead of night. The cordon, for all its intimidating officialdom, was porous. In the autumn of 1630, the inevitable happened. A case was identified within the walls of Florence, then another and another. The health board responded with swift, calculated precision. The house of the infected was immediately sealed. Its inhabitants, sick and healthy alike, boarded up inside for 40 days with food passed to them through a window. The patient was carted off to the lazaretto. The policy was logical, methodical, and ruthless. It was also ultimately futile. The plague was too fast, too insidious. For every case they identified, 2 more were spreading silently through the dense, crowded neighborhoods of the Oltrarno or San Lorenzo. The winter of 1630 to 1631 brought a brief false respite. The cold weather seemed to slow the contagion's pace, and the Florentines dared to hope that their measures had worked, that they had contained the beast. But with the warmth of spring, it returned with a vengeance. The city's meticulously organized systems began to break down under the sheer crushing weight of the numbers. The lazarettos, designed for hundreds, were soon swamped with thousands. Patients lay on straw pallets in crowded, filthy wards, the dying next to the merely ill, creating a perfect engine for amplifying the infection. The gravediggers, the bikini, could not keep up. The death carts, once a nightly somber presence, now rattled through the streets day and night, their bells tolling a constant monotonous rhythm of death. The city's famed economy ground to a halt. The workshops of the silk weavers fell silent. The studios of the artists stood empty. The Arno, the lifeblood of the city, flowed past abandoned markets and vacant palazzos. Florence, the city of Brunelleschi's dome and Michelangelo's David, a city built on the celebration of human potential, was brought to its knees. The streets, once bustling with the commerce and creative energy that had defined the Renaissance, were now eerily silent, punctuated only by the wail of a mourner or the cry of a plague official shouting, "Chi è morto," who is dead, at a shuttered window. The public health apparatus, for all its sophistication, had failed. It had been like building a meticulously engineered dam of sand against a tsunami. The force of the epidemic was simply too great, its biology too powerful for the administrative tools of the 17th century. The city's population was decimated. By the time the plague finally began to burn itself out in 1633, Florence had lost perhaps 15% of its people, and the surrounding Tuscan countryside had suffered even more grievously. The fall of Florence was in some ways more chilling than the chaos in Milan. Milan had succumbed to panic and superstition, a very human failing. Florence had fought the plague with logic, with order, with the best science of its day, and it had still been comprehensively defeated. The lesson was stark and humbling. In the face of nature's deepest furies, neither desperate faith nor cool reason was enough. The plague was a great leveller, and it cared not whether a city met it with a prayer or a regulation. It simply consumed. In the summer of 1630, as the sun beat down on the cobblestones of Milan, the air grew thick and heavy, not just with the oppressive heat, but with something else. It was the smell, a sweet, cloying odour of decay mixed with the sharp, desperate scents of vinegar, wormwood, and burning juniper wood. It was a perfume of fear. The normal sounds of the city, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the rumble of merchants' carts, the endless chatter of the piazza, had been replaced by a new terrible symphony. The tolling of church bells, no longer marking the hours but counting the dead, one frantic peal after another, until they simply gave up and fell silent. And beneath it all, a sound that would haunt the dreams of survivors for the rest of their lives. The slow, rhythmic creak of unoiled wooden wheels and the low, guttural cry of a single word. Manati. This was the sound of the world ending. The Great Plague did not just kill bodies. It dissolved the very glue that held society together. It started, as it always does, in the quiet corners of the home. The family, that ancient sacred unit, the bedrock of Italian life, was the first thing to break. In the early days, love fought a desperate battle against terror. A mother would tend to her feverish child, wiping a cool cloth on a burning forehead, whispering prayers even as she felt the telltale swelling in her own armpit. A husband would hold his wife, refusing to leave her side. But fear is a more persistent disease than any pestilence. As the death carts made their endless rounds, love began to falter. It was replaced by a primal instinct for survival. Soon the doors of Milan, of Venice, of Florence were bolted from the inside. When a cough was heard from a bedroom, the door to that room was nailed shut. Food, if it was given at all, was passed on the end of a long pole through a window. The sick were left with a jug of water, a piece of bread, and God. More often than not, they were simply abandoned. Sons walled up their fathers. Mothers pushed their own children into the street at the first sign of sickness, their faces masks of unfeeling stone before barring the door forever. Chronicles from the period, dry and official, record these horrors with a chilling matter-of-factness. One magistrate in Florence wrote, "The brother abandons the brother, the sister, the wife, the husband, and what is more serious and almost incredible, the fathers and mothers refuse to assist their own children." It was a retreat into the self, a severing of all bonds of kinship and duty. The city became an archipelago of terrified, isolated households, each one an island of despair, convinced that everyone outside was a carrier of death. Into this vacuum of compassion and authority stepped the Manati, the corpse collectors. They were society's untouchables, suddenly transformed into its most essential and most feared public servants. They were often convicts, offered a pardon and a high wage for a job no one else would do. Or they were the desperate poor, men who had already lost everything and had nothing left to lose. Many were survivors of the plague themselves, believed to be immune, walking through the stricken streets with a terrifying swagger. They were a ghastly fraternity, bound by their grim work. They often worked drunk, swigging cheap wine to dull their senses and their souls. They would kick down the doors of the silent houses, their faces covered with waxed cloth, their nostrils stuffed with sponges soaked in vinegar. They carried long hooks to drag the bodies out, showing no reverence for the dead, who were now just so much cargo. They became the kings of the dead city. With civil authority in ruins, the city guards and magistrates having either fled or died, the Manati operated with near total impunity. Their cry would echo down an empty street, and the healthy would shrink back into their homes, praying not to be noticed. For the Manati were not just collectors of the dead, they were agents of chaos. They were known to loot the homes they emptied, stripping the bodies of rings and coin purses. They extorted money from families, demanding payment to take away a loved one, or more sinisterly, demanding a bribe not to. The greatest terror was being falsely accused. A healthy person, perhaps with a valuable home, could be declared plague-ridden by a corrupt Manato in league with a venal health official. Once the accusation was made, there was no appeal. You would be dragged from your home, thrown onto the cart with the grotesquely contorted bodies of the truly sick, and hauled away to the lazaretto, the sprawling plague hospital from which almost no one returned. Your protests would be drowned out by the rumble of the cart and the laughter of your captors. The Carro della Morte, the death cart, became the ultimate symbol of the plague's inversion of the natural order, a vehicle of public health that was also an instrument of extortion, kidnapping, and terror. The lawlessness was not confined to these grim officials. With the city's watch decimated and its courts closed, a wave of opportunistic crime washed over the urban landscape. Houses marked with a cross to show they contained the plague were a tempting target for thieves who knew the inhabitants were either dead, dying, or too weak to resist. Ghouls roamed the potters' fields at night, digging up the shallow mass graves to steal the clothes from the corpses. Trust evaporated completely. The anointers, or Antori, became the focus of a citywide paranoia. These were figures, real or imagined, who were believed to be spreading the plague deliberately by smearing a greasy, infectious ointment on the doors and holy water fonts. In Milan, a public barber and a health commissioner were accused of being Antori, subjected to horrific torture until they confessed to an impossible conspiracy and then brutally executed. Their agony was meant to restore order, to give the chaos a name and a face to abhor. But it only revealed how deeply the social mind had fractured. When you can no longer trust your neighbor, your government, or even your own family, society ceases to exist. It becomes a mere collection of frightened animals trapped in a cage of pestilence and suspicion. The sound of the weaver's loom had been replaced by the rattle of the death cart, the engine of the Italian economy. For centuries, the envy of the world had finally, shudderingly ceased. The silence that fell upon the great workshops of Milan and Florence was a profound, unnatural thing. For generations, these spaces had been filled with the rhythmic clatter of looms, the cheerful din of apprentices, the sharp commands of the guild masters. This was where the world's most coveted luxuries were born. Velvets so rich it seemed to drink the light, silks that flowed like water, brocades woven with silver and gold thread. Now dust gathered on the intricate machinery, spiders spun webs across the half-finished tapestries. The workshops were tombs, their skilled artisans either dead or fled. The halt was absolute. It wasn't a recession. It was a full stop. The ports, the great arteries of Italian wealth, were clotted. And still, in Venice, the shimmering gateway to the east, the great galleys that carried spices, silks, and cotton from the Levant, now rotted at their moorings in the lagoon. Foreign ships approaching the city were met by guard boats and ordered away or forced into a brutal 40-day quarantine on a remote island, their crews often dying before they could ever set foot on the Rialto. The same was true in Genoa, the proud maritime republic whose sailors and bankers had financed kings. Its harbour, once a forest of masts from across the known world, grew quiet. The flow of goods, the lifeblood of these city-states, had been severed. Quarantine regulations, the cordon sanitaire thrown up between cities and states, were like tourniquets applied to every major trade route. Nothing moved. Letters of credit went unanswered. Contracts were voided by death. The entire complex edifice of international trade that the Italians had perfected ground to a halt. At the heart of this economic devastation was the collapse of Italy's legendary textile industries. This was not merely a matter of lost manpower. It was a catastrophic loss of institutional knowledge. The skills of a master weaver or a Florentine dyer were not written in books. They were a form of living memory passed down from master to apprentice over decades. An artisan knew by touch, by smell, by instinct, how to mix the cochineal to achieve the perfect crimson, how to work the loom to create a particular brocade. When the plague swept through the workers' quarters, it wiped out entire dynasties of craftsmen. It erased centuries of accumulated skill. The secret formulas for dyes, the subtle techniques of finishing a fabric, all of it vanished in the fever wards of the lazaretto. The powerful guilds, which had for centuries guaranteed the quality of Italian goods and trained the next generation of artisans, were hollowed out. Their meeting halls stood empty. Their membership rolls became little more than death registers. The financial system, Italy's other great pillar of strength, crumbled alongside its industry. The great banking houses, the Medici, the Strozzi, the Grimaldi, had built their fortunes on the bedrock of stability and predictable returns. The plague introduced an unbearable level of risk into every transaction. How could you lend money to a merchant for a trading voyage when the entire crew might die of plague in a foreign port? How could you collect on a loan when the borrower and his entire family had been carried away on the death cart? Debts went unpaid on an unimaginable scale. Capital, which had once flowed so freely from Italy to the rest of Europe, now vanished. City-states saw their tax revenues evaporate. The Florentine government, for instance, found itself utterly bankrupt, unable to pay its soldiers or officials, let alone fund an effective public health response. This created a horrifying feedback loop. The economic collapse made it impossible to fight the plague, and the plague's relentless spread guaranteed the economic collapse would continue. And as Italy lay paralyzed, its rivals to the north saw an opportunity. For a long time, the burgeoning textile industries in England and the Netherlands had been trying to compete with the Italian masters with limited success. They produced coarser, cheaper cloths, no match for the luxury of Florentine silk. But now the field was wide open. With Italian goods unobtainable, European markets were starved for textiles. English and Dutch merchants, whose countries were less severely affected by this particular wave of plague, rushed to fill the void. They began to innovate, producing lighter, more fashionable fabrics, the so-called new draperies that appealed to changing tastes. They copied and simplified Italian production methods. They captured Italy's traditional markets in the Levant, in Germany, in Spain. The plague didn't just temporarily disrupt Italy's economic dominance, it shattered it permanently. It was a great and final shift in the economic balance of power. The center of gravity of the European economy, which had resided in the Mediterranean since the Roman Empire, was now moving decisively to the cities of the Atlantic coast. Amsterdam, London, Paris, Italy, once the dynamic, glittering workshop of the world, was on its way to becoming what it would be for the next 2 centuries. A beautiful, fractured land of ancient ruins and past glories. The plague was the cataclysm that accelerated and cemented this transition. It was as if a great tide of capital, innovation, and power had gone out, leaving the Italian peninsula stranded, its magnificent economic engine rusted and silent, choked by the stillness of 1 million empty graves. The cost of the plague could be measured in florins and ducats, in bankruptcies and lost trade. But the true ledger was kept in human lives, and its accounting was almost too terrible to comprehend. The numbers themselves are so large they become abstract, losing their human meaning. They are phantoms on a page, mere statistics from a distant, cruel century. But we must try to see them for what they are. We must try to feel the weight of them. In the city of Milan, the vibrant heart of Lombardy, the population before the plague stood at around 130,000 souls. By the time the pestilence had passed in 1631, at least 60,000 of them were dead, nearly 1 in every 2 people. Imagine walking through a city where every second person you knew, your neighbor, your baker, the priest, the child who played in the street, was simply gone, vanished. This was the reality. In the Republic of Venice, the serene and powerful queen of the Adriatic, the plague scythed through the population with similar ferocity. Out of a city of perhaps 140,000, nearly 50,000 perished, a third of the population gone in the space of 18 months. The loss was so great that the Republic commissioned the magnificent church of Santa Maria della Salute as a votive offering of thanks for its deliverance, a stunningly beautiful monument built upon a mountain of corpses, and in some places it was even worse. The plague was not a uniform wave. It was a tide that surged more fiercely in some places than others. The city of Verona, famous even then as the setting for Shakespeare's star-crossed lovers, suffered one of the most appalling death rates in the entire peninsula. Historians estimate that Verona lost over 60% of its inhabitants, more than 3 out of every 5 people. Entire districts of the city were left empty, the houses silent and sealed, waiting for owners who would never return. Across northern and central Italy, the story was the same. Bologna, Parma, Turin, Florence. All of them were hollowed out. Their demographic vitality bled away. The total death toll for the Italian peninsula from 1629 to 1631 is impossible to calculate with perfect accuracy, but conservative estimates place it at well over 1 million people. In a country whose total population was perhaps only 10 or 11 million, an entire tenth of the population erased. But the true demographic catastrophe was not just in the raw numbers. It was in who died. The plague, while no respecter of class, was often most virulent in the dense crowded quarters of the urban working class. It swept through the artisans, the shopkeepers, the labourers, the weavers, the dyers, the very people who powered the Italian economy. It struck down men and women in the prime of their lives, the young parents, the skilled workers, the entrepreneurs. It created what historians call a lost generation. This wasn't a metaphor. It was a statistical fact. The demographic pyramid of Italian society was shattered. There was a massive gaping hole where the young and middle-aged adults should have been. This left a society top-heavy with the elderly who had survived, and bottom-heavy with a generation of orphans raised without the guidance, skills, and love of their parents. The world the survivors inherited was an empty one. There was a sudden bizarre abundance of everything but people. Houses stood vacant, their furnishings untouched. Farms lay fallow, the crops rotting in the fields. Workshops were fully equipped, their tools waiting for hands that would never again hold them. This led to strange economic dislocations. For a time, the wages of the few surviving labourers skyrocketed as they were in high demand. Property values plummeted. Fortunes were made by opportunistic survivors who consolidated the estates of their deceased relatives. But these were the tremors of a collapsing structure. The fundamental reality was one of contraction and decay. The psychological scars ran even deeper. How do you rebuild a world when you have seen it unmade? The survivors were haunted. They were haunted by the memory of the death carts, by the faces of their abandoned loved ones, by the omnipresent smell of death. This trauma manifested in different ways. For some, it led to a surge in religious piety, a belief that the plague had been a divine punishment for Italy's sins of pride and vanity. New churches were built, religious processions thronged the streets, and a deep cultural pessimism took hold. For others, the reaction was the opposite, a reckless carpe diem hedonism. If God was so cruel and life so fleeting, why not eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you will surely die? This dark fatalism permeated the culture for decades. The recovery was agonizingly slow. This was not a wound from which Italy could quickly rebound. The demographic shock was too severe, the loss of human capital too complete. It would take more than a century, in some regions nearly 2 centuries, for the population of Italy to climb back to the levels it had reached before 1629. And all during that long, painful convalescence, the nations of Northern Europe were surging ahead. Their populations were growing, their economies were expanding, their cities were dynamic centers of innovation. The Great Italian Plague had sealed the fate that the economic shifts had already prepared. It ensured Italy's long, slow slide from the center of the European world to its periphery. It was a biological event with geopolitical consequences, a demographic catastrophe that redrew the map of power in Europe for good. The forgotten epidemic had left behind a forgotten people, a country haunted by the ghosts of its own lost potential, a silence that would echo for generations. And so, while the bells of Milan and Venice tolled for a world that was ending, a strange and profound silence reigned to the south. The great peninsula of Italy, for all its shared culture and history, was in this moment a house brutally divided against itself. To cross the border from the Papal States into the vast kingdom of Naples was to step from one reality into another. One did not simply walk across this line. It was a frontier sealed by fear and guarded by steel. The kingdom of Naples, which encompassed nearly all of Italy south of Rome, was a sprawling domain under the firm hand of the Spanish Habsburgs. Its capital city, Naples itself, was a magnificent, teeming, glorious, and terrifying metropolis. With a population cresting 450,000 souls, it was one of the largest cities in all of Europe. Larger than London, larger even than Paris. It was a vertical city, a labyrinth of narrow streets and towering tenements packed with humanity, a place where poverty and splendor lived shoulder to shoulder. By any rational measure, Naples should have been a tinderbox, a paradise for pestilence. One spark, one infected sailor, one contaminated bolt of cloth, and the city would have become a charnel house on a scale to dwarf even the agony of Milan. And yet it did not happen. The Great Plague of 1630, which scoured the Po Valley and crippled Tuscany, seemed to halt as if by magic at the kingdom's northern border. This was not magic, nor was it entirely luck. It was the result of a rare and potent combination of geography, timing, and brutal, uncompromising statecraft. The Spanish viceroy, Fernando Afán de Ribera, Duke of Alcalá, may have been an administrator in a ponderous and often inefficient empire. But when the first credible reports of the plague arrived from the north, his administration moved with a swiftness and decisiveness that was utterly lacking in Lombardy. They had the luxury of time. The plague had to travel hundreds of miles down the length of the peninsula, fighting its way through town after town, giving Naples precious months to watch, to learn, and to prepare. The kingdom's geography was its first great advantage. Unlike the flat, open, and intensely interconnected basin of the Po River, southern Italy is dominated by the Apennine Mountains, a great stony spine running down its center. Travel by land was difficult. channeled through a limited number of passes and valleys. This made control far easier. The primary defense was the establishment of a formidable cordon sanitaire, a sanitary cordon along the entire northern frontier. This was not a theoretical line on a map. It was a physical, militarized barrier. The border, which largely followed the course of the Tronto River on the Adriatic side and the Garigliano on the Tyrrhenian, was sealed. Every road, every mountain path, every shepherd's track was placed under guard. Troops were deployed not to fight a human enemy, but a microscopic one. They had orders to permit no one to cross from the Papal States without a valid health patent, a fede di sanità, certifying they had come from a plague-free area. And even then, travelers were forced into quarantine stations, makeshift lazaretti, where they would have to wait for weeks under armed watch to see if the disease would manifest. Goods were treated with equal suspicion. Letters were smoked with sulfur and vinegar. Bales of cloth were unpacked and aired for days on end. Any attempt to circumvent these controls was met with the harshest of penalties. Smugglers, once merely criminals, were now treated as enemy agents, as potential mass murderers, and were often executed on the spot. The kingdom's extensive coastline was its other potential vulnerability, and here too the response was absolute. The ports of Naples, Salerno, Bari and Taranto were placed on the highest alert. A fleet of small, fast galleys patrolled the coastal waters, intercepting any unauthorized vessels. When a ship arrived from a suspicious port, such as Genoa or Livorno, it was forbidden to dock. It was forced to anchor far out in the bay, flying the yellow flag of quarantine. No one was allowed to disembark. Provisions were delivered by longboat with money exchanged by dropping coins into a bucket of vinegar. The sailors and passengers would have to wait, sometimes for 40 days or more, the quarantiner that gives us our word, staring at the city they could not enter, prisoners on their own vessel. It was an act of immense economic self-harm. Trade withered, merchants protested, but the viceroy held firm. The survival of the kingdom was deemed more important than the profits of a few. While the north bled its people, the south strangled its economy, and in doing so, it saved itself. There was luck involved, of course. A single breakdown in discipline, a single bribed guard, a single infected rat scurrying ashore from a quarantined ship could have rendered all these precautions useless. But the system held. The wall of vigilance built of fear and authority did not break, and so the Kingdom of Naples and the island of Sicily remained islands of eerie tranquility in a sea of despair. They heard the news from the north as one might hear of a terrible storm in a distant land, with pity, with fear, but with the profound selfish relief of the untouched. The great silence of the south was the sound of a catastrophe that did not happen, a silence bought with vigilance and paid for by the agony of their countrymen hundreds of miles away, whose screams they were spared from hearing. But those screams did not fade into nothingness. They were merely silenced for a time, waiting to be given a voice. They echoed in the dry official reports, in the private diaries of priests, in the folk tales of terror passed down from one generation to the next. For 2 centuries, the memory of the Great Plague of Milan remained a local trauma, a story told by Milanese to other Milanese. It lacked a chronicler who could make its horror universal, who could transform the particular suffering of one city into a timeless parable of the human condition. And then in the 1820s, that chronicler appeared. He was a nobleman from Milan, a quiet, deeply religious man with a piercing intellect and a profound sense of history. His name was Alessandro Manzoni, and he was about to write the most important novel in the history of Italian literature. The novel was titled I Promessi Sposi, The Betrothed, and on the surface it is a simple story. A young couple in a small village on the shores of Lake Como, Renzo and Lucia, are prevented from marrying by a petty, arrogant local lord. They are forced to flee, and their separate journeys take them through the landscape of 17th century Lombardy, a world of war, famine, and injustice. But the true terrifying climax of their story, the crucible in which their faith and their love is tested, is the Great Plague of 1630 as it descends upon Milan. Manzoni did not invent his plague. He researched it with the meticulous, obsessive dedication of a true historian. He was not interested in rumor or legend. He went back to the primary sources, to the eyewitness accounts. He spent countless hours in archives poring over the chronicles of the 17th century historian Giuseppe Ripamonti. He studied the reports of the Health Tribunal. He read the compassionate, sorrowful writings of Cardinal Federico Borromeo. He absorbed the data, the death tolls, the public edicts, the medical theories. And then with the soul of a poet, he breathed life into the dry dust of the archives. Through Manzoni's pen, the plague ceased to be a statistic and became a sensory lived experience. He does not spare his reader. He guides us through the streets of Milan as the city begins to unravel. We see the first hesitant signs of trouble, the strange markings appearing on doors, the rising public anxiety, the official denials. We feel the creeping dread as the city's leaders, paralyzed by arrogance and incompetence, fail to act. The Spanish governor, Don Gonzalo de Córdoba, is more concerned with the pointless war of the Mantuan succession than with the health of his city, a historical detail Manzoni uses to craft a searing indictment of political folly. When the plague finally erupts, Manzoni's prose becomes a panorama of ordered chaos. He gives us unforgettable, almost cinematic images. He describes the monati, the corpse collectors, drunk on wine and impunity, their carts piled high with the dead, a bell ringing their dreadful approach. He paints the chilling picture of the mother of Cecilia, a young girl who has died of the plague. She emerges from her house carrying her daughter's body, beautifully dressed as if for a feast. She gently places the child on the death cart, pays the monato to ensure she's not thrown onto the pile, and returns to her home to die alongside her remaining family. It is a scene of such quiet, profound tragedy that it has been imprinted on the Italian consciousness for 2 centuries. Manzoni takes us inside the Lazaretto, the vast plague hospital, a city of 16,000 souls living at the edge of death. Through the eyes of the hero Renzo who goes there searching for Lucia, we witness the sheer scale of the suffering and the small pockets of heroism that flourish within it. We see the Capuchin friars who heroically tended to the sick, organizing the vast, horrifying logistics of the dying. And we see the descent of society into paranoia. Manzoni masterfully documents the mass hysteria surrounding the Untori, the mythical plague spreaders supposedly employed by foreign powers to wipe out the population. He recounts the real-life trial and brutal execution of 2 innocent men, Gian Giacomo Mora and Guglielmo Piazza, who were tortured into confessing to this impossible crime. The column of infamy erected on the site of their razed homes stood in Milan until the late 18th century, a monument to the terror of a populace driven mad by fear. I Promessi Sposi was more than a novel. Upon its publication and subsequent revision, it became a foundational text for the newly unifying Italian nation. It provided a common language. Manzoni's clear, elegant Tuscan prose became the gold standard for modern Italian, and it provided a common history, a shared myth of suffering and endurance. For generations of Italian schoolchildren, Manzoni's plague chapters were required reading. They were the lens through which the nation understood its own past. The names, the places, the moral dilemmas, they all came from his book. He took the specific localized event of 1630 and elevated it into a universal story about the fragility of civilization, the failures of authority, and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable horror. He gave the silent victims of the plague a voice that would echo through the ages. He ensured that what happened in Milan would not be forgotten, at least not in Italy. And yet, despite the literary immortality bestowed upon it by Manzoni, the Great Italian Plague of 1629 to 1631 occupies a curious shadowed space in the Grand Museum of Western Memory. Outside of Italy, it is little more than a footnote, an event almost entirely eclipsed by the monolithic reputation of its terrifying ancestor, the Black Death of the 14th century. When we think of plague, we think of the years after 1347. We think of flagellants whipping themselves through the streets of Germany, of doctors in beaked masks, of Boccaccio's Decameron, of a pestilence that swept away a third of Europe's population from the Crimea to Ireland. The Black Death was a civilizational trauma, a biological catastrophe on a continental scale that redrew the map of European society. It has the grim advantage of primacy. It was the first, the biggest, the most shocking. In comparison, the Italian plague 3 centuries later seems to the distant observer a regional affair, a terrible but localized echo of that first great cataclysm. It ravaged Italy, parts of France, and southern Germany, but it did not engulf the entire continent. England at that time was preoccupied with its own internal politics, and Spain with its global empire. The Italian crisis did not shatter their world as the Black Death had shattered the world of their ancestors. There is another reason for its relative obscurity. The Black Death is often framed as an engine of change, a brutal catalyst that helped to end the Middle Ages. It upended the feudal order by creating massive labor shortages, empowering the peasantry, and shaking the foundations of the church's authority. It is a plague with a grand historical narrative attached to it. The Great Italian Plague of 1630 is harder to place. It arrived not at the beginning of an era, but at the very end of one. Its story is not one of transformation, but of termination. This, perhaps, is its most profound and overlooked significance. It did not cause the end of the Italian Renaissance, but it was the final devastating blow that confirmed its passing. By 1629, the golden age of the Italian city-states was already fading. The economic and political center of Europe had been slowly shifting for over a century. The discovery of the Americas and the new sea routes to Asia had marginalized the Mediterranean trade that had made Venice and Genoa rich. The rise of powerful centralized nation-states like France and Spain had reduced the Italian peninsula to a fractured battleground for foreign ambitions. The vibrant dynamism of the 15th and early 16th centuries had given way to a more rigid, more defensive and more provincial society under the heavy influence of the Counter-Reformation and Spanish dominion. The plague then was not an external shock that derailed a thriving society. It was an accelerant, a ferocious gale that hit a structure that was already weakened. The demographic collapse was staggering. Cities like Venice and Milan lost nearly a third of their people. Smaller industrial towns in Lombardy, centers of textile and arms production, lost half or more. This was a loss of consumers, of taxpayers, but most critically, of skilled artisans, merchants, and bankers. It was a hollowing out of the very human capital that had driven the Renaissance. While Italy was burying its dead, the new economic powerhouses of the North, the Netherlands and England, were laying the foundations of global commercial empires. They were seizing the trade routes, perfecting new financial instruments, and building the ships that would dominate the coming centuries. The plague delivered a knockout blow to an Italian economy that was already on the ropes. It cemented the shift of European power from the sunny Mediterranean to the grey shores of the Atlantic. It was the brutal biological punctuation mark at the end of the long, glorious sentence of the Italian Renaissance. And so, we are left with this forgotten epidemic, a calamity that reshaped a nation but barely registers in the wider story of the world. Yet its lessons remain chillingly relevant. It stands as a timeless and terrible monument to the deadly interplay of forces that we still wrestle with today. It began with a war, the small, strategically pointless War of the Mantuan Succession, which served as the perfect engine for transmitting the disease as armies marched and countermarched across the fertile plains of Lombardy. It was compounded by the arrogance and incompetence of political leaders who, as Manzoni so brilliantly showed, either denied the threat or prioritized their own petty ambitions over the lives of their people. And it was amplified by the very thing that had made northern Italy so prosperous: its dense network of cities, roads and trade routes, a web of connectivity that became a superhighway for the bacillus. It is a story about the collision of human folly and microbial reality, a reminder that the grand sweep of history can be dictated by things too small for the eye to see. It teaches us that civilization is a fragile membrane stretched thin over the abyss of chaos, and that sometimes all it takes to tear it apart is the passage of a single infected soldier, a single contaminated piece of silk, or the bite of a single flea carrying a microscopic cargo of death, a silent passenger on the great turning wheel of history.